What's up guys, Rotozap here, and today I'm excited to bring you the very first episode of what I think is going to be a brand new series on the channel, where I'm going to be, I guess, telling you everything that I know about PvP in the form of a guide. And what better place to start with the very first episode than with the beginning? What school should you even pick for PvP, right? Because whether you're just getting into PvP for the very first time, or you're looking to kind of get another character PvP ready, it can take weeks, if not months, to just get one character to be PvP ready. So it's definitely a tough choice in people's mind. You know, what should I pick? What should I go with? Because I don't want to regret spending all this time and, you know, probably money and everything on a character, and then I get in the arena and realize I hate this playstyle, I don't want to do this. So hopefully this video is going to help out with that. But before we get started today, guys, most of you that watch my videos are not subscribed, and basically all of you that watch my videos are not following me on Twitter. So if you did both of those, I really appreciate it. I hate plugging things, but a man's got to do what he's got to do. So without further ado though, let's begin. So I figured the most logical way to do this would be to kind of break the schools up into different categories and then talk about them respectively, some of their strengths and weaknesses, to get you a better idea of kind of, you know, what that school is like. And also, for the sake of timestamps, if I break them up, it makes things a lot easier because you can kind of, it'll make sense. So I'm going to divide these schools up by the pace of play. So whether they have a fast style, a mid-speed style, or a slow style. And slow doesn't necessarily mean that they're stalling or that they're, you know, their goal isn't to attack you or anything like that. It just means that they generally have a slower setup process, and they don't just spam hits. You know, they typically blade up or trap up, take their time, and go for, you know, more one-shot type of things instead of spamming hits. Whereas on the polar opposite end of the spectrum, you've got the fast play style, which very rarely sets up into hits. They'll probably put up some kind of bubble just to get like a passive damage increase, and their pet will typically carry some kind of aura as well to give them passive damage increases. But they don't want to do things that are only going to last one turn. You know, they don't want to put up a singular blade. They don't want to do stuff like that typically, because it just, they're going to be spamming hits, right? They want things that are going to always impact their damage, not so much one-time deals. So with that being said, I have up on a chart here a list of kind of all the schools and where I personally put them. So we've got Storm and Fire in the fast speed tier, we've got Myth and Balance in the mid speed tier, and we've got Life, Death, and Ice in the slow speed tier. And these are not in order of fastest to slowest, but they kind of are in a way. I don't know, that's more debatable. But anyway, I think we're going to start off with fast. So for the sake of timestamps, if you know already that you're a fast player, you like playing like that, then that's going to be this part of the video. Mid speed's going to be about halfway through, slow speed's going to be at the end. So let's get into it with Storm. So Storm versus Fire, right? Because I think if you're interested in a fast play style, you're probably going to be interested in either one of these. So I feel like contrasting the two directly is probably a better approach than talking about them individually. So I think that in terms of the meta right now, which is constantly changing, keep in mind, so this doesn't really matter that much, I think Storm is more favored than Fire, because Storm just has better options. They have a arguably better Scion, and they just put a lot more pressure on the opponent. Now Fire, though, does typically have more health than the Storm, so that's definitely a thing. But that doesn't stop Storm from being a good school or anything. So basically the difference between Fire and Storm is that Storm typically sets out for a Scion play or more of like an open shadow hit, whereas Fire typically, in this current metagame at least, is looking to do either trap stacking into one large Scion or repeated attacks of some kind, like, you know, maybe a Brim into a FFA or something, like, who knows, right? They just kind of do 2 or 3 piece combos, whereas Storm is just kind of like, I want all your blades off and I want an open Scion, you know? And honestly, that's why Storm can put a lot more pressure on than Fire, because as long as they can keep those blades off and they have plenty of options to keep blades off, they are constantly threatening something that will always one shot if it's open. It's kind of insane. And even if it's like, especially too if it's Pierce Enchanted, like a Pierce Enchanted Scion is wild. So Storm puts on a lot of pressure. But of course, if we're talking about should you play Fire versus should you play Storm, if you like a school that is, like I said, very fast paced, very high pressure, but the idea of overtimes kind of sounds intriguing to you, that kind of sounds like something that's up your alley, then that's something Fire can do, right? Because they do have more health. And if you play it, you can play it a little slower, right? You can take them to kind of a mid-tier speed if you want. So if you want to go that route and have that kind of flexibility, I think that Fire is probably better for you. But if you're like, no nonsense, no shenanigans, I want one-shots, I want crazy kills, I want quick games, that's going to be Storm, okay? Because Storm, they have really everything. They have kind of the perfect storm, no pun intended, for making a quick match, right? Because they either get their Scion or they don't. And if they don't get their Scion, then they're trying to do some kind of other, like, Phoenix, or what is it called? Like Thunderbird into a shadow hit, or, you know, just spamming Rain Beetles or Storm Beetles rather, until they can get an open shot on you. And if worse comes to worse, they can just Scion. Or I'm not sorry, they can't Scion. If worse comes to worse, they can just Insane, right? And Insane is insane. So Storm kind of has everything you need to make a quick game. They're a little less flexible. You definitely have to be applying pressure as a Storm. You can't take them down to a mid-speed, because it just kind of defeats the whole purpose of what Storm is, which is a school that is high pressure, high intensity. So if you're a player that is thinking, I would like something that's more fast-paced, and you're debating between Fire and Storm now, that's kind of the differences between the two. Storm is a lot more linear in what they do, and Fire is kind of more, you have a little more flexibility with how you can do your setup, or what kind of strategy you want to go with. And if worse comes to worse, you can kind of take a Fire down to a mid-speed if the match calls for it. Whereas with Storm, if you lose your pressure, you lose the match. That's kind of how I feel, at least Storm is. If they're not putting the pressure on that Storm is supposed to be, then they're just going to lose the match, because that's kind of what makes Storm so potent. But that's all I've really got to say about the fast speed schools. Let's move now into the mid speed schools, right? So Myth and Balance. And it's kind of hard to contrast these two, because they have very, very different play styles. Balance basically would qualify as a fast speed school if they didn't have a lack of a high damage spell like Scion. And they can Scion, but it's not really the same thing. It takes more setup, it takes blading, it takes that kind of more mid-speed vibe to get set up, instead of something like Fire or Storm, which kind of just immediately set up. So, but really what makes Balance good now, and what kind of solidifies them as a mid-speed school, is they have a bubble. So before, they didn't have a damaging bubble that was besides Gaze, obviously. And it just kind of, it hurt them, because Balance is a school that wants to play at a mid-speed, mid-high speed, but they just couldn't for a while, because they didn't have anything to passively increase their damage besides the shadow hit. And now they do, and they can get into bubble wars with people, and on top of that threaten a Gaze as a way to further the bubble war. So, you know, Balance is in a pretty decent spot right now, but again, they are pretty quick, no doubt about it, right? With the Aura Pop and Mana Burn, they are constantly threatening pressure on the opponent. It's just, the thing about Balance is they don't really have a great finisher. You know, they've got King Art, which does good damage, puts on a really solid weakness, basically Ifrit. And they have, like, I guess you can go for a Scion. If you're going for something completely different, like a Chimera Blade Stack kind of thing, or Elemental Blade Stack, that's kind of an entirely different thing, but it's still kind of in the mid-speed area, because you're still doing damage and putting on chip pressure with the Mana Burns and the Bubble Pops. But I don't know, it's hard to really say why Balance isn't fast, but also why it isn't slow, because they do things that are both, which is kind of what puts them at a mid. So I hope Just realize how like ridiculous I'm talking. I hope any of this makes sense to anyone, right? But Balance is kind of famous for control, and I think that that's kind of the identity that they have as a school. So instead of comparing them to Myth as a direct compare contrast, I think it's a good thing for this instance to talk about the identity of the school. So Balance is kind of like the controlling school. Okay, they can control the pips, they can control when you can put up an aura, and now they can control the bubble. So, and on top of that, they have weaknesses, and they've got elemental and spiritual diffuse, so they've constantly got a really crazy answer to a strike. So it's kind of like Balance is just the control school, which is why Balance is my personal favorite school, because it manages to be offensive while also having this tactical sort of like, I get to control how fast the game's going because I'm Balance. I get to do that. And that's not really a luxury that I think any other school has, besides maybe Death can kind of control the pace of play because they can constantly threaten a Scion. But besides that, no one really controls the game like Balance does. So that's kind of why I like Balance. Getting into Myth, though. Myth is like crazy good right now. I mean, Myth is arguably the best PvP school as of now, right? As of making this video. And they just have so much going for them right now. Number one, they have like the best Shadow Pip spell in the game, which is House Call. It does an absurd amount of damage, and it puts up a minion with a ton of health. Like, your opponent has to deal with that minion in some way, and it's not going to be with a wand, I'll tell you that much. It's gonna have to be with a real spell. They're going to have to waste pips on that minion. And if they don't waste pips on the minion, they're going to be sorry, because the minions do a lot. And of course, Myth was also given this Troll Spellment as of just recently, which that's broken. Like, that's really good. So again, just more of this minion pressure. And they can, at the very least, too, put up a Clockwork minion or whatever for 0 pips that can just break tower shields. And if your opponent doesn't deal with it, they can't put up tower shields. So basically all of this on top of, we haven't even talked about Mystic Colossus yet, the spell that literally does a pierce before it does damage. Basically, you can't shield against a Myth. That is kind of the thing. Like, Myth is so good at removing shields right now, whether it be because of minions or their own spells. You can't shield against against a Myth effectively. That's just how it is. Weaknesses are really the best way to go. So it's hard to shut a Myth school down because most people don't carry weaknesses. And Myth just has so many things in their arsenal that do a lot of damage or that provide some sort of utility that makes the move really good. Like, for example, Athena does very good damage for 5 pips, allows you to conserve out of it, and on top of that gives you a shield. So it's like a mini Abominable Weaver that doesn't use a Shadow Pip. Really good. We already talked about Mystic. Okay, Mystic is not only a minion killer because it hits everyone, but it pierces before you do damage. So, you know, if you've got a bunch of buffs going, you've got your damage bubble out, maybe a blade, maybe your reliquary, possibly some remaining traps from your myth fuel. Okay, you can do a crap ton of damage with that if your opponent only has a shield on thinking that they're safe. Yeah, and if for God knows why they give you an open shot, Baba Yaga is going to do a ridiculous amount of damage to them and summon you a really helpful minion. So as far as I would say what myth is really good at right now, like I said, it's just removing shield. Like, they can put on so much pressure to your opponent because your opponent's just not able to shield. And that makes Myth really strong, really dangerous. And combo that with the fact that Myth has really interesting utility spells and the ability to kind of take themselves from... Oh, wow. Got disconnected there. But anyway, what was I saying? So besides the Pierce and all the great shield things that they have, what's the icing on the cake, right? If all this crazy toolbox stuff that Myth has going on isn't enough, they also have a crazy pressure Scion, okay? All you need for that Scion are 3 stun blocks. 3, okay? And that means, okay, what do? You put on 2 sets of stun blocks? But here's the thing, right? Putting on stun blocks, that's already par for the course in a regular match. Like, you always put on stun blocks anyway. That's not even anything extra, you know? And it's also not something that your opponent can really remove, because if you think about what most of the other Scions require, it's blades, it's traps, it's something that can come off. Stun blocks typically aren't something that are going to come off during the course of the game, especially if you have 2 sets of stun blocks on. Your opponent's just not going to touch them, especially because you only need 3. You actually don't need 4 for Scion to do double damage. So as soon as you get 2 stun blocks on, or 2 sets of stun blocks, I mean, that's immediate pressure. That is immediately terrifying for your opponent because you're threatening a Scion. So Myth is really good. Like I said, I think that they are probably the best school right now because of all the things that they can do. But yeah, that's if you're looking to play a mid-tier school, or not a mid-tier, if you're looking to play a mid-speed school, you can't really go wrong with either of these options. Balance and Myth are both very good in the meta right now. Very mid to high. I think Myth is the best, but Balance is a high mid-tier school, right? Maybe even high tier. But anyway, we're gonna move on to our slow boys. Okay, the ones that kind of take their time with the game. Maybe. I don't know why I'm talking like this. Anyway, so we're gonna start off with Death, and what we're gonna find with a lot of these is that they have a pretty linear play style. Like it's like they always kind of do the same thing, but the actual tricks and stuff that they can do is a little different between the 3 of them. So Death is a fun school for sure, but typically if you don't like the idea of blading up and then cheesing with a green oak or something into a deadly minotaur or poison or something like that, you're probably not going to enjoy Death. The one perk that Death has over every other school is that they are by far the best school to take care of people and strike with, because you can Beguile, which might throw your opponent off if they don't have a blade in hand or a bubble or something to reduce backlash. And on top of that, they have Dispels just like any other school can, so that's already 2 turns of their strike just gone. And then, of course, you can throw on a set shield, or you can even actually use Bad Juju, right? So you can effectively cancel their strike with Beguile, Dispel, Bad Juju. That's a pretty high pip combo, but you're going to make them take a lot of backlash if you do that, especially if they have a bunch of blades on and we're expecting to go for a big hit. So you can really throw them off with that kind of combo, and that's something that really no other school can do. So it's definitely something on the side of Death. On top of this, Death is one of the only schools that actually kind of benefits the most from having a slower playstyle, because Death Scion requires them or the opponent to be below 33% of their max health. So Death is okay with having a longer game or taking things slower and maybe soaking up some of the damage, because then they're threatening a tree, which could immediately end the game, or at the very least drain back enough for them to get back in the game. So, and that's of course the one other huge differentiator that Death has compared to every other school, is they have drains, and drains are kind of cool. Now they get countered pretty hard by set shields, but they are still very fun in concept, and definitely something that I think people enjoy doing with Death, especially since drains were buffed in the last update. But like I said, Death, there isn't really a whole lot to say besides the things that make them unique. They just blade up essentially into large hits, or blade up into a Scion or something like that. You know, since your Scion does require you to be at low health, it makes you more okay with dealing with some damage. And like I said, they just are very, very good at dealing with people that go into strike. So, but besides that, that's all I've really got to say about Death. Moving into Life. Life is kind of at a really awkward stage right now, because with the nerf to crit healing and Jading also kind of being killed as a viable option because of the timer, it puts Life in this really kind of weird position of, you know, what do we do, right? What exactly do we do? And I don't even have the answer for you, really. But Life definitely takes things slower because they typically do heal, which any school that is going to heal is probably going to be a slower or mid playstyle. But honestly, like, I don't know. Life can either blade up into like a really big spiny or something like that, or they can kind of just slowly chip their opponent down with Wings of Fate, Luminous, things like that. And that's kind of what I've been seeing Life doing, is just chipping their opponent down with Wings of Fates, Caterpillars, and Luminous. And even though it's like a spam strategy, it's like a slow spam because they don't focus on damage necessarily. It's just more about wearing the opponent out over time and being this sort of like big, bulky bruiser kind of character. But we haven't really seen it to much success. Like, I've definitely seen Life having success with it. I personally haven't tried out this new like bulky bruiser strategy on my Life, so I can't really speak for it. But yeah, I think Life is just kind of in an awkward place right now, and they tend to take things slower, I think, in this current meta. And I think part of that too is just due to apprehension, because no one really knows what to do with Life at this point. So because of that, people don't really know how to play. People take it slower just by default because they don't really know what to do with Life. But I don't know, maybe you can be the person to figure out what to do with Life, or maybe an update will come out that'll make it more abundantly clear what strategies are viable for Life. But currently, it's a little ambiguous. Life does have Guardian Spirit. They've got pretty good heals. They have things like that. Luminous Weaver, Hungry Caterpillar, and Wings of Fate are kind of going to be your bread and butter. All three of those are very, very high utility, great spells. Wings of Fate is a great minion killer. Hungry Caterpillar is a great way to protect shields, and Luminous Weaver is a great way to do some chip damage as well as weaken your opponent at the same time. But really, that's all I've got to say about Life, guys. I don't like, Life is weird. Okay, we don't really know what's going on with Life. But finally, last but certainly not least, we have got Ice. And Ice used to kind of be a spam school in a way, because they would just spam Abominable Weaver, and in some ways they're still doing that. But with usually around 70% universal resist, around 10k health, and a fair bit of damage, this is a slow school, right? This is kind of the definition of a tanky bruiser strategy, okay? And they definitely blade up into frostbites. That's 100% a thing. They like to keep their damage bubbles out and hopefully an aura up, because they definitely like to benefit from passive damage, because they're kind of this weird hybrid of like, they like to spam their Weaver. They really like to spam Weaver, because Weaver is a defensive move as well as an offensive move. So, you know, why wouldn't you want to be using it as much as possible? It puts on a shield, it does damage. You can't, doesn't really get much better than that in terms of doing two things in one turn. So yeah, I think, like, I don't know, I don't really personally like Ice's that much. I don't like that playstyle very much, because to me it's kind of taking like the worst things of a lot of the slow schools and just bundling up into this big disgusting package that for some reason works. But that's not to say that Ice is like a bad school or anything. They have cool, unique things too. Like, they have some fun utility spells like Steel Ward that can be used to cheese off shields, and they just have like interesting stuff going for them. Interesting stuff, I guess I can say. But typically, if you're playing as an Ice, your playstyle is not going to differentiate much between matches. It's just going to be establishing bubble control, getting a couple blades up, putting on pressure with a frostbite, and then going to town with Weaver. And that's kind of it. And then in between all this, right, because you're putting on some pressure with frostbite, you're doing Weaver damage, and you're relying on the fact that you have a stupid amount of health and stupid amount of resist to keep you alive until your opponent finally like passes out from exhaustion because of your bombardment of hits. So that's kind of what Ice is. It's just wearing your opponent out before you get worn out, and that's it, really. So slow characters in general, I think, all revolve around sort of blade stacking strategies, or at the very least, slow spam kind of things. If you were to play this, you know, it's kind of a mixed bag, because I think Ice is one of the better schools in the game right now. Death is one of the middle schools in the game, and I think Life is probably the worst school in the game right now per PvP. So if you are someone that likes a slow playstyle, it's kind of a mixed bag for what you can choose from right now. But certainly, just because a school is like dead last in PvP or whatever, doesn't mean that you can't play it and have fun on it. It just means that it's going to be significantly harder to get Overlord on it compared to something like a Myth. So that's it, guys. That's all 7 schools. We talked about them all. We talked about some of their strengths, maybe a couple of their weaknesses, and just kind of what makes that school special, right? So if you enjoyed the video today, make sure to let me know. If you have suggestions for what you want episode 2 to look like for the series, that would also be really appreciated. But yeah, that's all I've really got. I mean, play the school you want to play. Like, at the end of the day, too, I briefly touched on where I think things lie in a tier list. That doesn't really... the reason I only briefly touched on it, because I don't think it matters. I think you need to play whatever style you like playing, and that's going to make you improve as a player. Because it doesn't matter if Myth is the best school in the game right now. If you hate if you don't like mid speed, if that's like not something you enjoy, then you're not going to have fun playing Myth, and you're probably not going to do well as a Myth. So yeah, just because something is high in the tier list doesn't mean that you're going to be successful playing it. Except maybe Ice. But besides that, right, I think that you just need to play what you want to play. It doesn't matter what tier it is. That's just, yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about anymore. So thank you guys again for watching. And that's all I really that's all I got. So I wrote his app out. Peace.